Week 14. Last week, I refactored the data layer in my app. In other words, all the functions that interact with Superbase's backend have been improved. They now have a consistent naming scheme, consistent signature, consistent return types, as well as the correct designation of suspend or blocking functions. So if you were to review my code for my data layer this week, I think you'd be pleased. Although I don't know how picky you can be, I'm certainly pleased. In addition to refactoring the code base for the data layer, I also learned quite a bit about the power of Superbase backend. In particular, the Postgres database, like what a Postgres database can do. In the sort of traditional or the old school way of doing backend, you're supposed to have a backend service that receives requests from your client and then determine what to do with the database, which contains your sources of truth. And obviously that increases a lot of development complexity. Not only would you have to do the front end, you'd have to, and in addition to that, the database, because you're going to have a place to store your data. You're going to have to develop another layer that stands in between, which is the back end, which can cost a lot of money if you're a company and can cost a lot of time if you're an indie developer. Before I started using Superbase, one of the reasons I picked it is because they advertise that Postgres database itself can handle a lot of the backend services by itself. In other words, you don't even have to have a backend for a lot of things, and the database can just do it by itself. I didn't quite know how powerful it was going to be. I was prepared to use at least a thin layer of edge functions to intercept and sort of coordinate between my front end and the database. Turns out you can do a lot. So as one example, I have a field in a database that I do not want the client to ever touch. Right? When a row is inserted, I want that field to be populated by the database, and I don't want the client to touch that field at all. Again, in a traditional setup, you would have a backend that intercepts the client request and then work some authorization logic and then update the database accordingly. So the backend would just essentially be the sort of the guard, the security guard for your database. However, with Postgres, you can just do it within Postgres database itself. You can set up a database trigger, which in this case would be before update. And a database trigger itself can invoke a database function. In this case, you can invoke a function that preserves the value of the field that you don't want to be tampered with. Now, this is, of course, besides setting up row-level security and all of that stuff. This is just to affect the change or the non-change of the database row. But you can do this in the database itself. You don't have to have a complicated backend. This is very powerful, and I found myself using a lot of this without really having to worry about any sort of backend infrastructure. Now that said, per my understanding, I suppose current tenuous understanding of the backend after having used it for like just a couple weeks, for more complicated logic, you're supposed to take it off of the database and put it into an edge function. Right? An edge function is just a microservice for a backend. And I did have to do that for one of my functions. And that function in particular calls a number of backends, external backends, depending on logic. And if you were to put all that into SQL, into Postgres database, that can get yucky real fast. The other problem that you would run into, and I certainly did, is I haven't figured out a way to do like easy source control with database schema. All the functions and stuff that are saved, in the cloud. I don't know how to source control it, right? Like if I were to change something, it's just changed. I have not figured out a way to sort of idempotently modify the structure of the database, including the trigger and the schema and the functions. However, if you were to lift some of the logic outside of the database and put them into edge functions, you can source control the edge functions fairly easily. So I'm still sort of exploring how to best marry the two functionalities, the two sort of capabilities of the Supabase backend, specifically the edge functions, which are quite a bit more powerful, that can be source controlled, but then introduces another layer of complexity and latency, and the Supabase Postgres database's built-in triggers and functions. That said, though, just having those tools at your disposal that you can easily just call from your client, I'm spoiled. I was worried that I was going to have to worry about just a full stack backend and deal with, Spring Boot and all of that crap. And thankfully, I don't have to deal with any of that. So that's the current situation. Data layer has been refactored. Postgres functions, triggers have been explored, and I've started using Supabase edge functions for my functionalities. So next week, and by the way, the rudimentary UI is actually finished. It's not polished yet, but all the hoses are hooked up, so the UI can actually call the correct database. Call the correct functions in a data layer to make changes to the database. Next week it is going to be more of an exploratory week. I need to figure out how to deploy a web front end. So currently the way it works with my app is that I'm using Kotlin multi-platform. I'm targeting iOS, Android, and desktop. Desktop being an app running on JVM, on any platform that has JVM installed. Kotlin multi-platform has an experimental version for web. It's really yucky to use. I watched some tutorials and some samples, and I really do not want to have to touch it. And as a result of it being in the experimental stage, like, many things can change tomorrow, and I don't really want to have to learn or write something that has to get changed very quickly. In any case, it wouldn't be robust enough for production. So one of the things I'm exploring, and that would be the target for next week, is using another service, specifically the Jamstack. I learned that there's acronyms for everything in tech, and the Jamstack to deploy a web front. In my case, because I've already had limited experience with Hugo, to deploy a very simple blog web page for the journey that I am on right now, and where the videos are published and where my thoughts are published. I discovered that you can actually use Hugo to deploy a fairly fully functional front-end, web front-end that is static. In other words, you don't require a back-end to churn out different web pages for different users. It's just static. It's served really quickly. And then for anything that needs changing on the static web page, you just call REST API backends. And then that might be the holy grail. I have to learn to use Hugo to make this implementation work, but hey, that can give the user probably a very good experience, because everything is going to load lickety fast. And then your hosting footprint would be minimal, and I believe you can just host it on Cloudflare pages for free, and then I think they promise unlimited traffic, because again, it's static, right? If I can make that work, that'd be great. That's the goal for next week. So yeah, very interesting and much more rapid development than I thought it was going to be, and we'll see where we land at the end of next week. Thank you for joining me this week, and I'll see you next week.